Over the past several years, we've done videos on multiple iterations of the C8 Corvette, from the Stingray to the Z06. We've gone to the factory, we've talked to the engineers who developed the car over many years. And now it's time for the E-Ray, the first all-wheel drive Corvette. And this adds electrification, a motor in the front, a battery pack, which we detail all of the technical stuff in the shop. The question is this a true Corvette?
So the E-Ray is the subtle supercar to anyone that didn't really know the car. Comfort and capability in all road conditions. And I'm going to give an example here. I've been driving the E-Ray now for over a year, and so in all weather conditions, and have another Chevrolet product, a Tahoe, and I feel more comfortable, maybe not in 8 inches of snow because it's not a very good snow plow. However, more comfortable in 6 inches or less of snow in the E-Ray than I do in that car. When this vehicle was developed, it was before I was even a Corvette. When this vehicle was in its inception, GM hadn't even announced that the direction to focus on EVs. This was a vehicle that we were adding technology to purely for performance reasons, not for any other emissions or any other benefit. GTO was the first car that came here that I worked on. And then probably my favourite, which I've got sitting in it was the first thing I told my wife I'm buying when I come here, is a Gen 5 Camaro. That was the next one that I was heavily involved in. Yeah, like a kid in a candy store working on Corvette. It's an amazing car to work on and super excited about. And particularly the E-Ray, I love now that we have revealed it. I can talk about with family and friends. And I love being able to do that. Looking forward to this video being online so maybe I don't have to talk to them about it. I can say, hey, here's a video, have a look at this.
So this is a through-the-road hybrid vehicle. There is no mechanical connection from the front drive system and the rear engine DCT that we have from the Stingray. So in the front, we have a 160 horsepower, 120 foot-pound drive motor. And in the tunnel, we have an electric battery, a 1.9 kilowatt-hour pack. And in that pack is integrated the power electronics, which is your power inverter and your DC-DC converter for all of your electric controls and drive system. So this was architected to be the electric all-wheel drive, where we can rely on the front drive system as a bit of an actuator for the vehicle in the dynamic modes in which we need it.
So it is predicting at a very high level, it is predicting what is the tractive capability of the tires. But it is also balancing that with, yes, I have this much grip, but can I use it without unbalancing the car? So that all happens predictively based on very raw driver inputs. What is the driver doing with the steering? What is the driver doing with the pedal? What kind of surface we are on? What kind of PT mode we are in? So all that information is accounted for to understand, to model what should the vehicle be doing at this stage. Another aspect that I think is interesting about how the all-wheel drive and ELSD system works together is especially in that mid-corner to corner exit phase, where as you initially tip into the pedal, the all-wheel drive system is producing very little torque. but we still want to have the same yaw character to the vehicle. So the ELSD torque is actually higher in that phase because the torque on the front axle is low. But as you roll into the pedal some more and go further into the corner, then the e-motor will come on, but the ELSD clutch torque will drop, so that the yaw or the yaw that both actuators are creating is consistent, so you don't feel any step change or you don't feel like the driving experience is inorganic. And for me, I think it's a bit more personal for me because I've been working on this project ever since I started working at GM 6-7 years ago. So I started from when this even didn't look like a car. All it was a physics model in simulation. So taking the car from there to building controls around it, to seeing it in person, have the customers, the media drive it and give us all their feedback, it's incredibly gratifying. It just gives me, I'm so proud of what I've been able to do personally, but also Team Corvette, of how they've treated this product, because compared to like a Stingray or a Z06, there is heritage. We kind of understand what we need those cars to be. This was a completely new ball game. So we had to invent things of what we even want the vehicle to feel like. So, and I was part of that team. I was all of us took some great decisions together and to put the car where it is right now, and I couldn't be more happier the way it turned out.
Corvettes, Jack's favorite pastime. I bet you he's silently wishing there was about 5 more trim levels we could talk about and torture me with. The E-Ray specifically, we heard about what it is and what it's not, and the term hybrid gets thrown around a lot. And this car has nothing to do with like a Prius or an eco car, so we know that. We've gotten that out of the way. So what do they do? What is this on the technical level?
So let's talk about what this car is overall. As we heard from Trevor, this is a Super GT. And traditionally in the past, what the Corvette has struggled with, to be fair, most sports cars struggle with this, as you add performance, you decrease the bandwidth of usability of the car. It becomes less approachable, it becomes less usable in the real world. Think Z06 and Z01. Those are cars you don't want to drive in the rain or in the snow. They're less comfortable, they're less livable.
And they're harder to drive fast.
Yes. This is the first time they've designed a Corvette where it is actually the quickest Corvette they've ever built, but it is in fact more usable than a regular Stingray due to the E all-wheel drive setup. Why did they go with an electric motor? Why is it a hybrid? Well, the E-motor, the drive unit in front of this car, was the easiest way they could package an all-wheel drive system in this vehicle that had no mechanical cons. You didn't have to run a drive shaft from the drive unit or the gearbox in the back of this vehicle. You could package it easier without entirely compromising the mechanical structure of this vehicle. Now, before we talk about the drive unit and the V8, let's talk about the body structure and the chassis of this car. So the body on this vehicle is the wide body found on the Z06, which means it's 3.6 inches wider than the standard Stingray. The advantage of that is the aero capability of this vehicle and its ability to fit a bigger, wider wheel and tire package. So the aerodynamics of this car are essentially identical to that of a non-Z07 equipped Z06. However, the aero balance has been shifted forward to take advantage of the front traction and the front torque available of this electric motor. So in the highest downforce configuration, you get about 366 pounds of total downforce at over 180 miles an hour. And in this car's case, because it doesn't have the gurney flaps and all that other fun bits, it's a zero lift, zero downforce configuration. It is a very hard thing to achieve in a sports car to not make these things feel like giant wings. Now, from a chassis perspective and body structure, they actually had to alter the physical body structure of this vehicle, basically from the front bulkhead forward. Because of the drive unit in front of this vehicle, they had to raise the shock towers to fit the drive unit, of course, the half shafts. By doing that, they had to add back some of the structural integrity. So you get this giant shear plate in the front, and on top of the strut tower, they also added a strut tower brace to maintain that reactiveness they needed under track conditions. The physical suspension hardware is a carryover when it comes to control arms and bushings. So the bushings in the front and rear control arms are right off of the Z06, which means they're like 30 to 40% stiffer than you find in the Z51. However, the ride frequency of the E-Ray is much, much softer than the standard Z06. The Z06 with Z07 is like 40 to 45% stiffer than a Z51 Stingray. This is probably like 10 or 15%. It's still a GT car, and it rides exceptionally well, particularly when you factor in how massive the wheels and tires are on this car. You get two 75s in the front, three 45s in the back, and this is the first time ever that a Corvette has been developed with snow performance in mind day one. This car comes standard on all-season tires from Michelin, and then when you get the performance package, which is really just a tire package on this car and an aero package, they add back the Pilot 4S's that you're used to from the Z06. These are very, very capable cars. The other thing to bring up, and this is something I've seen a lot, is why did they make the alignment more aggressive in this car versus a Z06, despite the same amount of mechanical grip? Well, the truth is, it's because there's adding propulsion ability to the front end of this car. They wanted to take advantage of the entire setup. The main reason they actually increased the spring rate too versus a Z51 is the added weight. They had to negate, and that's the fine print of this. This is a big heavy car at over 4,000 pounds. And the aero of this car as well. The fact that there's more downforce meant they had to add more spring rate.
And it makes sense too, because you're driving the front wheel. So those tires no longer just have to turn, they're actually taking power at the same time. So at least in track alignment, that's what you're saying, at 2.7 degrees of negative camber, it's a lot more than the car used to, well, the Z06 had. So all these tweaks, again, to Jack's point, weight, extra power, and of course the change in design of the car driving the front wheels. That's what necessitates a lot of these changes. However, again, it's still about balance. You would think having an all-season tire, and that's what I thought when I first saw this. I'm like, oh gosh, they're totally nerfing this entire vehicle. But these tires longitudinally are unbelievable in terms of the grip. The fact that when you launch, even in wet conditions, you don't lose, you always seem to have traction, is the perfect setup for most average street drivers to make use of the power that this is trying to apply. So these tires were specifically designed for this car with Michelin and Corvette. So they're not just like, you're not going to Tire Rack and throwing some like touring tire. It is a specific tire for it, and they're insanely wide, to your point. Not something you traditionally see on normal cars.
Yeah, and they had to blend all of this, like the sway bars that come off a mix of the standard Stingray and the Z51 equipped cars. So you get the front bar off a Stingray, the rear bar off the Z51 equipped cars. They had to blend all of this with how the brakes work. Yes, hardware-wise, these are the carbon ceramics off the Z07 equipped Z06s. The carbon ceramics come standard. The unique thing about the brake setup on this vehicle is, yes, they're brake-by-wire, just like the regular C8, but they blended Regen in with the actual braking setup. So this car is always trying to regen, even when you're in ABS, and they blended that feeling in with the pedal. So when you're on the brakes in a braking zone or in regular conditions, the idea is that you don't feel the regen system working, and it's true.
Regenerative braking obviously is very important to this car because we need to put energy into the battery, and there's no other way to do it. So, first of all, we will blend regen with friction braking, and we have regen on the front axle only. So we have to be very careful to make sure that it's natural, that when we regen on the front axle and blend in friction braking, have friction braking on the back, that, together it's harmonious, it's understood, it's and reacting to what the driver command is. The great news is, because electric motors, again, are torque machines, as soon as you touch into the pedal, we're very responsive. We can give you regen right away, even as the brakes are getting ready to build power and pressure.
Yeah, I think to add to what Keith just said, it gives you that extra actuator to use, although it creates a more complex controls problem because the hydraulic system is all connected together, but the e-motor is separate. So if you don't do anything, you will have a very front biased brake balance. So it's very important to coordinate that, and especially while trail braking or turning into a corner, we are doing that actively to manage what is the right level of regen that we want to give to charge up our battery, but without ruining brake balance. That's always a continuously we've tuned and worked around to find what is the right balance between the two. And we also have beyond that, like some algorithm which are looking at the wheel stability. So if you put the vehicle into ABS, the front axle goes into ABS, it will first pull friction brakes, still try to see is it the region that's causing the wheel to be the wheel lockup, and if not, it will still keep regen in. It's not until it realizes that it needs to pull regen to control the wheels, it will pull regen. So that's how important it is for us, and that we go to the very last mile to get everything we can.
All right, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the drivetrain.
So in the back, let's start with what's carryover. You get the LT2, which is essentially the same other than an auxiliary starter motor. You get the same 8-speed Tremec dual clutch gearbox. However, they added an auxiliary pump to deal with this maintaining oil pressure during e-motor operation.
Yeah, start, stop, and all that.
And when you can drive this in front-wheel drive mode, when it's just the front e-motor propelling you around, the reason that is doing that is essentially get you out of your neighborhood in the morning. You can only drive this in e-mode in the very beginning. When you turn this car on, you can't just swap in and out of e-mode. It's just to get you out of your garage, basically.
And then as soon as you reach a certain threshold, much like a hybrid car, after you hit a certain command of throttle position, it will fire up the gasoline engine. There is one side note, there is stealth mode and there is shuttle mode. And stealth mode is when it starts up in EV mode and you can drive out of your driveway. That's not always available based on temperature and battery state.
Yeah, and it's only good for like 3 or 4 miles at least in stealth mode. Yeah. Shuttle mode is just to get you basically in and out of your garage. All right, so the way the all-wheel drive setup works is, the best way to describe it is this diagram that Saurabh helped made for us. And Saurabh was the controls engineer on this car. He'd been working on it for 7 years. And huge thanks to both Saurabh, Trevor, and Keith for being a part of this project.
And I think one of the things that gets lost before we get into the rest of the technical stuff is our ability to do this. A large part of why we do this is because we get to interact and meet the people that are actually doing the work on the back end that you never see. Because everything's shrouded in marketing, in 10 layers of bullshit and specs and all of this. And then in the background, there's some guy who's like, man, I spent 7 years of my life just trying to make this feel like a normal car and work. They are the people that are actually making this happen. So it's important to us to include them and talk about the work that they did. So again, thank you, and appreciate the people that are watching this. Please take the time to appreciate that as well.
So the way the e-motor works is, I'll break this down into steps. So again, traditionally there's always torque being sent to all-wheel drive setup in the front. However, the motor will turn off in this car in corner entry and mid-corner. They wanted this to have the yaw sensation, or the ability to steer the car under throttle in the back end. However, as you are in corner exit, the motor starts to kick back in and help you shoot out of the corner. It acts as a traction aid. It also allows you to do bigger power slides. So as you're yawing out the car, when the car is looking at what you're doing, it's both predictive and reactive. It uses the front motor to help you carry on the drift and then not basically let you spin this thing out, which I'm sure you still could, but it's baked into the PTM modes and the e-diff as well. So the e-motor, through a module they added to this car, is constantly talking to the e-diff to figure out how much the rear clutches are allowing you to slip and unslip and adjust the car.
So we actually gave some liberty to be able to leave the suspension loose enough that if you want and care to drift this car, this will do some of the best drifting that you can do in any vehicle. The front axle will continue to pull you through, so it's actually a little bit of a trick to remind yourself to stay in the accelerator pedal, to let the front axle continue to pull you around the drift. And so to develop these controls and work, the team spent countless hours drifting vehicles at Milford Proving Grounds.
The e-motor is also acting as a propulsion aid. So when you're launching this car using launch control, the e-motor actually gets power first. It helps shift the weight balance back on the rear wheels. Then the V8 kicks in and gives you that sub 2.5, 2.4 seconds 0 to 60 in that 10.4 quarter mile. The e-motor is also pulling you through shift moments. So traditionally in a normal car, every single time the car is shifting, the car is no longer being propelled forward. For a brief second, power is being cut. The e-motor is pulling you through those gear shifts, so there's never a lack of forward momentum.
It's combining the best of essentially what electric cars can do, giving you that constant pull and torque, with the old traditional internal combustion method. Think of if you had a manual transmission, the biggest loss of time is that in between shift to clutching in and shifting. And imagine if you took that away and the car was still going fast while you were shifting. That's what this is doing. And you would think that it wouldn't feel natural, but it's very, very well calibrated to the point where it's like, oh, I wish I had this on every car.
Yeah, it's incredibly impressive. The fine print of e-motors is, of course, the faster you go, the less torque and efficient they are. So at a certain point, and in this car's case, 150 miles an hour, which is a higher speed than you will ever see at most tracks and any American road, public road, the e-motor decouples itself using a clutch, so it's no longer adding as a propulsion aid. However, if you start going less than 150 miles an hour, it seamlessly kicks back in and adds back the traction to the front end of this car.
Now on paper, this looks very simple. And sometimes that's actually the best way to design a system like this without overcomplicating it. One of the big worries with electrification is you strip out a lot of the connectedness or driver feel. That's not what they attempted to do here. Now, granted, this generation Corvette has isolated you out quite a bit. It's supposed to be that GT car, that can do everything. So adding this electric motor doesn't really take away, because the highlight still is the V8. The highlight is the V8. So this is supposed to just augment that whole experience, and it has. But there are sacrifices, and you mentioned weight is one of them. The other thing is you still have to cool a battery pack, and you still have to cool an electric motor. There still is that system there and that loop. So how did they deal with that?
So the reality is you got to keep all of this cool, and the truth is people don't realize that keeping battery packs cool and electric motors cool is very difficult. Most batteries have a very, very small thermal window, and then they run into thermal runaway where you can't cool them down anymore. You got to pull off the track and allow the system to cool down, like we had to do for the Lucid Air Sapphire. This doesn't have that problem. They have a oil cooler up front for the electric motor, then they have a water glycol solution for the battery pack. The battery pack is incredibly small. It's a pouch style from LG Chem, and they have 50% coverage with a cooling plate. So when they ran a 24-hour Milford track test, this car never ran into a thermal issue. It always was within the thermal window it needed to be to operate effectively. The fine print of that, though, is because the battery pack is small, you can reach a D-rate state. You'll never reach that D-rate state on the street because you're always applying brakes, but on the track, due to the extreme commands you're asking of the electric motor on very, very long straights, constantly on the throttle, you can derate the motor. The motor does not turn off when you reach a zero state of the battery, but it does not produce all of the horsepower available.
And when you do get to that point where the battery pack has nothing left to give you, there's still a large buffer. And that buffer exists to power the all-wheel drive system for traction and stability. It's a stability-only system. It's no longer helping you to propel until the Regen builds the battery up back to a suitable level to give you back the propulsion. Again, it's a GT car. There are sacrifices, like we talk about every electric car of this generation, every system. They had to choose between cooling, and they had to choose between the size they had to work with the existing technology and the mass. So this is the solution. And on the street, it's really, really flawless for the most part. We haven't had it on track, but I'm assuming it would still be really interesting there as well.
Yes. The thing to note about this car is it's a street car. Yes, there is increased track performance and capability. They claim that this has similar, not the same lap times as a regular Z06, not a Z07 car. But because the Z06 existed, this car could become less extreme. It's like the Porsche philosophy, why they have all these different trim levels. Yeah. This trim level exists to satisfy street buyers. The Z06, because they knew this car existed, did not need to be as compromised purely as like a fun, soft GT car.
Makes sense.
So Mark, with all of that said, I think it's time for us to drive this vehicle and see what it's like to live with on the street.
All right.
Oh boy, that's proper, Mark. That is a proper amount of acceleration.
What's going on here, Jack? Why does it sound like we're in a jet engine?
Well, Mark, this is the E-Ray. We've bored everyone to death with all the technical information. Now it's time to talk about how this thing drives. And naturally, it's starting to drizzle out, so we're going to exploit the all-wheel drive to the best of our ability. The way this thing launches is unlike pretty much any other car we've driven. Not so much in the speed, but the way you feel the electric motor in the front pull you forward. Between shifts, off the line, there's this tremendous sense of torque fill that makes it very unique versus something like the NSX, where the front electric motors aren't really doing a whole lot as far as forward propulsion.
Yes, it is a very unique and different experience from a traditional Corvette? And I think that's what most of the people are going to be asking us. Well, if you take a standard Stingray with just a V8, people love the sound of it, but it lacks the speed of the Z06. The electric motor in here is essentially performing the role of a supercharger, right? Like, you're getting the extra power from it in the front to give you the acceleration, if not more than that of the Z06. You have electric car torque pulling you, and the coolest part about it is because you have a traditional same dual clutch transmission, as that's shifting, the electric motor's still pulling you, so you don't have that drop off in power, those little dips that you get from those shifts. The car is still going forward, and it's such a weird feeling. It combines the specialness of like an electric car, just a little bit of that electric car feel, with the old school feel of the engine and the transmission, and that's what makes this quite fun. And it's not even a novelty. I thought at first, okay, it's going to be a gimmick, you're going to get over it, but it really feels fast all the time.
And as you're about to get back into a straight where we can sort of pound this a little bit on the street, want to give me some noise, Mark? Normally, I don't like fake engine noise in cars, but because you have that like heavy fourth order of the LT2, the 6.2 liter, and that motor normally is a little flat when it comes to the higher frequencies, I actually like the way the E-motor fills in some of that like sound synthesis up top, and it's well calibrated to as you tip into the throttle.
I think most people that get into this are going to really appreciate the sound, and I'm the biggest complainer about synthesis, fake noise. Because I feel like it takes away from the experience. It's a distraction. And I'm not going to say this is not a distraction, the sound, because when you're in the higher drive modes, as you told me, it gets louder. And I think because of the tone that they chose to fill in the sound for the electric motor, that high pitch, they're blended together really well, where it's a pleasing sound. But I will admit the novelty of it does wear off pretty quick, but luckily it's only there when you're going flat out. So it builds harmonically, it builds as the speed picks up. So if you're under like 40 or 50, whatever, you're not hearing it as much until you get to like 90, 100, and then it's driving, that driving force of the sound is very unique. I still say that there is some fake engine noise pumped in here as well, much like the Z06. And to me, I wish there was a way to just completely disable it. I know they bake it in, it's a part of their strategy, but for somebody that doesn't want it, it's all software, you should be able to disable it.
I think the last thing I'm going to talk about drivetrain before we get into the handling parts of this car, I had some complaints in the regular C8 and in my Z06 and the way the dual clutch feels. It lacks some of the imperceptibleness of the PDK, meaning you do feel it when it shifts. It's not the most transparent thing in the world, where because the E-motor is filling in that torque dip, it actually ends up smoothing out some of the weirdness of this gearbox.
100%. I was going to say the same thing, where there was any clunkiness before in the previous car. That's why I said it literally has the best of like EV hybridization, even though this is not really a hybrid. It has the best of that feeling with the old school internal combustion feel. And I know a lot of people complained about the Z06 sounding too exotic. It didn't have that raw, like old school muscle car V8. So now you have that, and you have that electric propulsion and the smoothness that the electric motor brings to the table, combining with the dual clutch. To me, I expected this to be a total gimmicky mess. I really did. I thought it was going to be a total fail.
I had low expectations.
I had very low expectations. We came out of the NSX, which is kind of the closest thing to it's not close to this, but there's similarities, and that car had some serious deficiencies that this picks up on in soul and heart. There is a lot of soul to driving this car.
So Mark, let's talk about suspension and handling. I know we're not on the track, but to be fair, this is a street car. We're even on all seasons.
Have you ever had a problem with traction in this car? Ever. Even on all seasons. We've had no problems breaking this thing loose, ridiculously, losing control of it. Even in a straight line, you would expect there'd be a massive amount of wheel spin with the amount of power this thing's putting down. And granted, we're in a little bit of slippery here, but still nothing. You have the confidence to put your foot literally to the floor.
I imagine this car on a back road, a really tight mountain road, which does not exist in Illinois,
Yeah.
you'd probably be faster than both a regular Stingray and a Z06 because of the corner exit traction and the ability to put all of the power down all the time. So as we get into our few corners that exist around here, it's a very interesting car in the corners.
So talk me through it. You know, when you come in braking hard and you're taking manual control and you're trying to pull out of the corner.
So what I think is interesting about this car is corner entry and mid-corner, the car essentially behaves rear-wheel drive. The E-motor does not interact very much with the drivetrain. It's essentially off, and it's allowing you to yaw the car like a regular Stingray or like a Z06. You can balance the car on the throttle. And then as you get out of the corner, as you're trying to straighten out the vehicle, then the E-motor kicks in, and it helps you pull out of the corner where you're not dealing with a giant oversteer moment. Or, as I've been able to do in some of the on-ramps around here, get the tail to swing out on this car, the E-motor pulls you through the drift. So it feels a little, I don't want to call it entirely inorganic, but it feels a little interesting in that, yes, you are correcting an oversteer in a way that you normally would not do in either a traditional all-wheel drive car or a rear-wheel drive car, but it is very, very effective, and it gives you this high sense of confidence in this car. And you combine that with, again, the fact that, yes, while this is a little stiffer than a Z51 Stingray, it is still a very, very compliant car, particularly for how high the performance is compared to a Z07 equipped Z06. At least to my butt, it's like 25 to 30% less harsh. The ride frequency is substantially lower, making this a much easier car to live with.
And there's a couple other things to talk about with that is, you know, because you have all-wheel drive and you have the flexibility of doing what they're trying to do electronically with this, this is a car that is insanely fast, but gives you the confidence to go out in the wet, which a lot of Corvette drivers are never going to go out in the wet or the rain or the snow. To be fair, you're probably not going out in the snow, but you could.
Yes.
And the systems are calibrated to do that. And what I really like about the way that they've combined this, and this is a blessing and a curse on the Z06, but less so here, because it has to be something to everybody. It has to be a touring machine, it has to be a speed demon, and it has to kind of go track. What I really like about that is the flexibility that they've given you to go soft. Like right now I'm in Tour. And Tour not only just softens up the suspension, but it will put it into cylinder deactivation. It will shut the exhaust off essentially, where you can't even hear the engine. You don't hear the chatteriness of the engine. You don't hear the exhaust. They lean on the electric motor in the front a little bit more to propel you, and it's a quiet car. It turns into a GT car, which is really good when you're stuck in traffic. And I drove this, and I'm like, I kept it in track mode a lot because I wanted to hear it. But after a while, I got annoyed. Like, honestly, I got annoyed, and I put it in Tour, and it was like, okay, now I'm in a quiet car. I don't feel the bumps on the road. I can really tune out the rest of the world. And that's something this car does better than most, having that dual personality, which is great. And the other part is the EV startup part, which we didn't really talk about. It's such a subtle thing, but it makes such a big difference starting it in the morning. Like, you can put it in stealth mode where you just roll out of your driveway in EV or at night. And if you're trying to sneak in from seeing your, 50-year-old mistress, you don't want to alert the family, you put it in, you roll in your driveway, they don't even know you're gone. They're like, oh, honey, what were you doing? I'm like, oh, I was working so hard upstairs, baby, I'm sorry, just burning the midnight oil. So there's that effective, flexibility of this car that they really thought out a lot of this, and that's what makes it more than just a party trick to have the electric motor in the front.
I think to the point of the engineers, and this is either a blessing or a curse, depending on how you feel about driving, this is one of the first high-performance Corvettes that they've developed that is still very easy to drive, and there's minimal compromises. Traditionally, when you did Z06 or ZR1, as you increase the performance bandwidth, became a less livable car. This is not the case of the E-Ray.
Yeah, Jack, I mean, when you told me about this, like every Corvette you tell me about every single day, I got really, really like, why are we doing this again? And I think they've reinvented the genre at an affordable sports car price. Like, I know 100,000 plus is a lot of money, but what they're delivering here for that price is unquestionably one of the best things I've ever done. By a long stretch.
I think this is the argument people have, or the question people have, Z06 or E-Ray. And I will tell you, I would not want to go flat out on a back road in a Z06. This is like the difference between like GT3 and 911 Turbo S. This is a car that is easy to live with, very fast in a straight line. While it is less raw, where you don't have the LT6, you don't have necessarily the same level of connectedness. This is a car that you can use more often, and honestly, on a back road like this, is faster.
I would agree with you. Like, I have zero issue with this car in terms of like wanting to drive even like 50%. I'd be afraid to drive in this amount of water in your car in the Z06, and this, it's like I can still pound around in a safe manner and have complete control of this thing. It's really cool.
So Mark, with that, I think it's time for us to head into the final thoughts and wrap up this incredibly long video. Final thoughts on the Corvette E-Ray. Huge thanks to our GM PR reps and of course the engineers who helped us with this video. So what do I think of this car? Well, electrification is a dirty word for many car enthusiasts and particularly Corvette owners. What the E-Ray does well is it bridges the gap between people who love V8s and people who see the advantages of E-motors. And this car is case in point of that. The performance that they managed to extract out of the E-Ray is remarkable, and it allows people to access essentially near supercar levels of performance for the low $100,000 range. And that's the thing that is the greatest about the E-Ray, the performance that you can experience in the real world. And this is the first time a Corvette of this performance level is truly 365 days capable. This is a car you can drive year-round. Unlike a Z06, you should drive year-round. The advantage of this car is its all-weather capability, its comfort, and of course, its brisk speed. So what are the cons of this car? Well, it inherits many of the deficiencies of the regular C8. You can argue the styling is polarizing, the interior cockpit is a bit cramped, and of course, the steering feel, despite being very direct, and some of the overall isolation of the dynamics is still there. Past that though, I think this is a very, very impressive car, and I think one of the most impressive vehicles for the price currently on offer. So with that, thanks for watching, I hope to see you soon.